And also coming on Saturday, as we release this podcast, June 8th, 22 years ago, 2002, you were there. We've talked several times about Lennox Lewis defeating Mike Tyson to retain the heavyweight title in my hometown in Memphis, Tennessee. What else do you remember about that?
Well, I've covered a lot of fights, as you know, TJ, and I've got certain memories, about. Well, the crazy thing is there are certain fights I've covered where I have like very, very little memory, but some I've got massive amounts of memories. And this is one of those fights where there was so much stuff going on and such a big deal and so many things that were happening that I have a ton of memories about. Though not just the fight itself in terms of Tyson and Lennox Lewis, but the entirety of the buildup, getting to the point where they got the deal done, being there in New York City when they had the press conference that never happened when Tyson and him got into the brawl and he bit Lennox on the leg and the fight was no longer going to be in Vegas. They had to find a new location, which is how they wound up in Memphis on a postponed date. And then obviously the whole fight week, the craziness with the deal between HBO and Showtime, which was unprecedented at the time. Now networks will sometimes work together. We've seen it happen a few times, but at that time, the notion that HBO and Showtime would work together, that was the thing that you were like shaking your head, like there's no way this fight can ever happen. Not going to happen. And you'd have
And
like executives.
the reason again, and you've explained this before, but for the fans that are newer, is Showtime had the exclusive deal to show Mike Tyson's fights.
Yes,
And if I'm correct, Lennox Lewis's deal was exclusive to HBO. So
100%.
there's the roadblock of who gets to broadcast the fight, and uniquely
So,
they both did. So go ahead.
so the interesting thing about that was a couple of things. Number one, it ended up happening because it was sort of like a perfect storm. Number one, Showtime needed the fight to happen because Tyson owed them millions of dollars that they had loaned him, and the only way they were going to get that money back is to have this fight. So that was one aspect of it. Another aspect was you have Lennox Lewis, this great champion, whose career is going to be left unfulfilled if he doesn't fight Tyson, which was kind of weird because Mike was pretty much done. But the public wants what the public wants. The heart wants what the heart wants, and they wanted Lennox Lewis against Mike Tyson, as Lennox so aptly said many times, including in the HBO Legendary Nights documentary. There was nowhere I could go where people didn't ask me, when are you going to fight Mike Tyson? So he went to the people at HBO who he had been a loyal soldier to HBO for many, many years. He had fought virtually his whole career of consequence on HBO. And he was like, I want this fight. How do we get this done? And they came up with a lot, and it became much more complicated after the biting and the brawl at the non-press conference. It became a much more complicated thing. But in the end, they worked it out. But the particular thing about the broadcast rights that was always fascinating, I did a very extensive story about all the deal points in USA Today. That was crazy, the things that they had to do. But in terms of the broadcast specific, number one, they had to agree because HBO was very proprietary about their broadcast team and their production values and all that. Showtime had its own similar thoughts about how the shows should be run. What they decided to do was first of all, they merged for the fight night broadcast on pay-per-view. First of all, if you ever watched the pay-per-view broadcast, neither network had any signage. It was just a big, big banner. Lewis Tyson is on. You didn't see a Showtime banner. You didn't see an HBO banner. Nothing on the signage. Nothing on the ring mats. Nothing on the graphics. Nothing.
That and my Penny Hardaway retired number jersey in the rafters of the pyramid in Memphis, Tennessee, from my Memphis State Tigers, my alma mater. Continue.
So they had to work that out, and then they merged the broadcast team for the fight night. So they ended up having a conglomeration of their broadcast team with the Showtime team. So that ended up being Jim Lampley doing the blow-by-blow, and they took the Showtime analyst, which was Bobby Ches, and he worked on the broadcast, with Jim Lampley. And then the other folks that were not there, like they had Fran Charles was doing HBO events. They paired him with Larry Merchant I guess it was Roy Jones for the possibility of the replay. This was the interesting thing. And Showtime had Steve Albert, who was their normal blow-by-blow person, and they brought in Sugar Ray Leonard. But here's the thing. They both called the fight for the live pay-per-view. Then each network had a separate broadcast team to do the possible replay. The way that happened was the side whose fighter won was going to get the exclusivity on the replay rights. Now, if you remember, the second time when HBO and Showtime paired up for a pay-per-view it was Mayweather-Pacquiao.
Right.
But that was not about which of their guys won. What they agreed to for that was simultaneous replays. So the following Saturday night at the same time, 10 o'clock, 9 o'clock, whatever it was, HBO and Showtime at the same time premiered the replay of the exact same fight night broadcast that you saw if you bought the pay-per-view. In terms of the Lewis-Tyson fight from many years before that, the way they arranged it was the winning side would get the rights to the replay. So HBO won because Lennox knocked out Tyson. So HBO got the rights to the replay, which meant you saw on the HBO broadcast, you saw what they taped that night, Larry Merchant and Fran Charles. So you did not hear Jim Lampley and Bobby Ches on HBO. Showtime had a replay that never aired. Now, my dear departed friend Jay Larkin, who ran Showtime Boxing from day one until he was unceremoniously fired, 20 something years later, had said to me, we had dinner in Memphis the week of that fight, and he knew I was a big video collector, and we were talking about what they were doing with their replay, and he said to me, no matter if our guy loses, I'm going to make sure you get a copy of our replay. So a man of his word, that Jay was. I don't know, a month after the fight was over, I was sitting in my office at USA Today, and I get a piece of mail, and it was a DVD. Jay mailed me their full broadcast of Lewis versus Tyson, called by Steve Alpert and by Sugar Ray Leonard, that never actually aired on Showtime. I mean, it's never aired anyway.
You've talked about that before. You have that as
so,
part
but
of the
so I know that's not about the fight, but that was a very important aspect of how this fight came to be.
Of how it had to be made.
Yeah, HBO and Showtime both had to finally, take a step back from their positions and agree to do that deal the way it was, among other things that they, that the two camps had to deal with. But that allowed this fight to happen, and in the end, it was the largest grossing fight in the history of boxing at that time. It did just about 2 million pay-per-view buys, which was ridiculous. It did more than, in terms of dollars, it came after the Evander Holyfield Mike Tyson ear-biting fight. It did fewer pay-per-view buys, but it did more revenue because the tickets were priced higher, the pay-per-view was priced higher, et cetera. So it did humongous business. And I mean, I spent like basically a week in Memphis for that fight, and it was like a party. Everywhere you walked, the whole town just opened its arms up for everybody. You walk down Beale Street, it was a party 24/7. We were staying in a hotel right on the corner of Beale Street and some other street. And
there you go.
We partied for 6 days, but we worked our asses off. I mean, this was such a big fight. Again, I think I've talked about this before, but it was not just national sports media, but it was all media. So
of course,
the Tonight Show, one of the biggest shows in the country, right? The late night talk show with Jay Leno at the time. They hired Dave Chappelle, the comedian, to come to Memphis and be like their on-site reporter, in quotes, for the fight. And so Dave would walk down Beale Street at night and he would do like a report every night for the weekend leading up to the fight. That helped a huge amount of publicity, among other things. And Dave would like do random man on the street type of interviews with folks. So I and at the time, Tim Smith, who was the Daily News New York boxing writer, him and I had hung out with Dave Chappelle and spent some time with him and walked around Beale Street with him and watched him do some of that activity. It was such a blast. That whole week was so much fun, way more fun than a lot of major fights are today, to be quite honest with you. And then they put on, I mean, it wasn't a great fight, but it was at least a conclusive ending. And it determined that for that era, that it was Mike Tyson, Evander Holyfield, and Lennox Lewis were the biggest three names, that it was Lennox Lewis that stood the tallest because he had knocked out Tyson, even though Mike wasn't what he was. He had defeated Evander Holyfield and unified the titles. And he could not go through his career without having fought Mike Tyson and get the respect that he gets now, all these years in retirement.